Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami. He is an Oxford University trained historian who's had a long academic career at Tel Aviv University, but left the ivory tower and went on to serve as Israeli ambassador in Spain and then as Israel's foreign minister in Ehud Barak's government. In that capacity, he participated in the July 2000 Camp David summit with then President Clinton, Yasser Arafat, and Prime Minister Barak. He also led the negotiating team, the Israeli negotiating team, in all the phases of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, right down to the last-ditched effort to reach a peace agreement in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001. In many ways, it was the closest Israel and the Palestinians came up till that point to reaching a peace agreement. After leaving politics, Professor Ben-Ami founded the Toledo International Center for Peace in Spain, where he currently serves as vice president. He's also a professor emeritus at Tel Aviv University. He's the author of a number of books, including Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, The Israeli-Arab Tragedy, which I highly recommend, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and his latest book, Profits Without Honor, the 2000 Camp David Summit and the End of the Two-State Solution, which is published right today by Oxford University Press. And his talk today is based upon this book. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Ben-Ami, who was previously, I should have noted, a fellow at the Nazarian Center. So we're very happy to welcome him back online. During his presentation, you're welcome to send us questions for him using the Q&A box, and I will select those questions and put them to him in the Q&A section of this webinar. So without any further ado, let me turn over to Professor Ben-Ami.
Thank you, Professor Waxman, for this very generous introduction and for hosting me in the Nazarian Center at UCLA, of which I have very dear memories. As we speak today, a major tragedy is unfolding in Europe. This is one of the most grim moments in the history of the continent after World War II. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has already changed much of the security architecture of Europe, and I believe its effects will reverberate for long years to come also globally. It seems that the ghosts of Europe's past were brought now back to life. Now it is again 20th century stuff, no longer the stuff of the 21st century that we hoped would be an era of restrained and peaceful resolution of conflicts. I'm sure that it will affect the Middle East as well. Every corner of the globe will be affected by this momentous tragedy. And I believe that when it affects the Middle East, it will touch also the question of Palestine, which has always been an essential part of the regional strategic game, as it were. The book I am introducing to you today is a march, a narrative and analysis through the sadly inconclusive story of the Israel-Palestine peace process from the 2000 Camp David summit to practically these days. This is done always with an eye to the broader regional context and to the interplay of global powers and international stakeholders. Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian can rightly claim to have parental rights for this book. He came to see me 2 or 3 years ago, between 2 and 3 years ago, because he wanted to see my diaries of the Camp David process for a play he wanted to write on the drama of the misencounter between the main characters in the summit, Clinton, Barak, and Arafat. Jonathan probably got drawn away from it by possibly more intellectually rewarding preoccupations, although he promised me that he will still get back to it at some point. But I took the idea in order to produce a book that goes far beyond the Camp David Summit. It's about the Camp David Summit and beyond. At least more than half of the book is relates and analyzes the story of the process after the Camp David Summit. An attempt to explain and analyze the entire process as it evolved during the Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama and Trump presidencies. So it is an attempt to encompass the entire process. As I said, it is not just a story of frustration and despair, based on what I am convinced was our prophetic platform or elaboration of a platform, the Clinton peace parameters and the peace offers that sprang from it during the presidencies of Bush and Obama. I came to the conclusion that the only way, frankly, to salvage the cause of peace in Palestine is by integrating those peace parameters into a Jordanian Palestinian solution. All other alternatives are ominous scenarios scrutinized throughout the book. The one-state solution, violent unilateral disengagement, and all other possibilities that emerge, such as, for example, one that will be addressed in this forum by Dr. Yossi Beilin, the Israeli Palestinian Confederation. I will represent here a critique of that idea as well. So my vision is to have the solution based on Jordan, Palestine. There has been a funereal historiography on Camp David, but I think it is unjustified. I think that Clinton was not an adventurer when he came when he invited the parties to Camp David. He had a conceivable endgame in mind that was offered to him, that was suggested to him by the parties. The summit also broke taboos that were never addressed previously, and the Clinton parameters that were offered were elaborated 6 months after the summit, need to be seen as part of the Camp David process. The Palestinians were absolutely right when, at the beginning of the summit, they argued that this is not a conflict that can be solved in a couple of weeks in the enchanted hills of Maryland. This is something that will need other stages. And in that sense, the Clinton peace parameters and the negotiations that took place after Camp David, leading to the Clinton peace parameters, were part of the process. So I don't address here the summit as such. I address the Camp David process, what happened before the summit and the evolution of the process after the summit down to the Clinton peace parameters. In that sense, the Clinton peace parameters are the product of laborious negotiations, not the whim of a lame duck president. He offered a point of equilibrium between the positions of the parties as they developed during the negotiations, and I still believe that these parameters remain to this very day the framework for a possible peace, only if it is integrated into a broader Jordanian Palestinian solution. In my book, you will see I address personalities because I believe that they were extremely important. Although finally they didn't make the peace that we all hoped, but obviously analyzing the personalities is an integral part of our attempt to understand why the process failed. And I can understand why Jonathan Friedland was so keen and is still so keen of writing a play. On the one hand, you have President Clinton, brilliant, industrious, but what a former or the late Israeli defense minister Moshe Dayan would have called a nice fellow in the bad sense of the expression. That is, he lacked the persistence of Jimmy Carter, and and frankly, the Americans did not manage well the summit. The summit ran itself. It was not led by the Americans. And then you have Arafat, an extraordinary and iconic figure for the Palestinians, a legendary leader, the founder of the Palestinian national movement. But then he had his flaws. He was incapable of closing the gates of this conflict. He wanted to leave it half open. He would never give you a definite answer. When Lloyd George was once asked what did he think of Eamon de Valera. De Valera was the leader of the Irish national movement in the 1920s. And his answer was that negotiating with de Valera is like picking up mercury with a fork. That is, with Arafat, it was always like picking up mercury with a fork. You can never know whether he said yes or not. So the weaker side in a conflict can have sometimes also its responsibility. History is a textbook of moral paradoxes, and it is absurd political correctness, in my view, and sometimes even post-colonial patronizing, to assume that the weaker side can never have a responsibility for the tragedies that had befallen him. In that sense, Arafat has a historic responsibility for having rejected the Clinton peace parameters, which, like every peace offer, is never ideal, but it is optimal. It is never the thing that you dreamt of, but it is the kind of framework that can bring dignity, sovereignty, independence, and development to your nation. Fuad Ajami once said, Fuad Ajami was a Lebanese Shiite scholar who lived most of his life most of his academic life in America. I think he taught in Johns Hopkins. He wrote a piece after the failure of Camp David, saying that the Palestinians believe that a mysterious higher power will always come to their rescue, as if the laws of history did not apply to them. Now, of course, there is a lot of responsibility for the occupier. The occupier hasn't created the ideal conditions for the Palestinians to say yes, because throughout all the negotiations, even under Rabin, settlements continued to expand, and the arteries of Palestinian life were upset constantly in the territories. So in that sense, I think that although I don't truly believe in history as a court of justice, and historians are not judges to impose penalties or responsibilities on any of the sides. So that the best way to see it is that we all, the three parties, the Americans by their mismanagement of the summit, we by not understanding at the very beginning what does it take to make peace with the Palestinians. we did not understand how central was the question of Jerusalem. And we started with offers that were ridiculous. When the first meetings before Camp David, Barak suggested a Palestinian state on 60% of the land or 65% of the land. So if you start by proposing 65 of the land, and then before we go to Camp David, you propose 87%. And then when we end Camp David, you propose 92%, why the Palestinians will not persist in negotiating? So when we got the Clinton peace parameters 6 months after the summit, that was the best vindication of Arafat's rejectionism in Camp David, because here he got in the Clinton peace parameters a far better deal than the one he was offered in Camp David. So he was right, but then he failed in understanding where is the point of equilibrium, that if you persist in putting pressure on your interlocutor, you lose everything. You break the spinal cord of your interlocutor. Politically you break your interlocutor, and then you have nothing. That was very, very typical of Arafat. Now, I have in this book also a very long chapter on a comparative analysis of Palestine. I compare it with other peace processes in an attempt to explain the singularity. This does not whitewash our political sins, but at least it explains why it has become so desperately difficult to resolve Palestine. The chapter is Defying the Logic of Conflict Resolution. This is the last chapter of the book. I truly hope that policymakers, pundits of the Middle East story, students of conflict resolution, and the many fervent activists for either Zion's or Palestine's cause will draw lessons from this revisit of the Israeli-Palestinian conundrum about what was right and wrong in our peace enterprise. All this stands at the center of any peace attempt, any peace negotiations everywhere. The chapter deals with the difference between interstate negotiations and asymmetrical peace talks between a democratic state and a national movement. It addresses the utility of secret peace talks, the link between peacemaking and domestic constraints, the dilemma of negotiations under fire, and the consequent deficit of legitimacy for peace talks. When I say under fire, I mean the Second Intifada. Peace talks were conducted throughout the Second Intifada. So I analyze that in the context of other peace processes, whether conflict, negotiating under conflict is an incentive to peace, or it can be an obstacle. I address the question of whether the importance of trust in peace negotiation has been overblown, the role of the mediator and the consequences of his faltering methods is also addressed here. The difference between, or the tension between tangible and non-tangible categories in the peace negotiations, either real estate, which is the stuff of politics, and non-tangible issues, which is the stuff of theology. So these are two kind of categories that make tangible issues sometimes more manageable, more soluble than non-tangible issues. The question of narratives, the clash of narratives between the Israel story and the Palestine story has made these conflicts so desperately difficult to resolve, because it is not like say the Israel's peace with Egypt. That was a real estate business. Egypt got back the Sinai Peninsula, and it gave a peace agreement to Israel, and this is all. When it comes to the Palestinians, we are talking about religion, refugeeism, the ethos of the refugee, the need to resolve the problem of millions of refugees, the question of Jerusalem, millennial certificates of ownership. So all of this makes the conflict so very difficult to resolve. The story that I tell about Camp David and the processes or the stages of the process that came afterwards shows that history has seldom single inflection points where one act or omission proves decisive. Rabin's assassination, for example, has been, in my view, accorded a disproportionate bearing on the prospects of peace. Our failure to clinch a final settlement was, in my view, a defining failure for the two-state solution has proved to be a structural impossibility. I took from the Camp David experience a sense about the irrevocability of our dispute, a perception that will subsequently be borne out by the serial failures of all and every future peace enterprise discussed in this book, which was why immediately after the Taba conference, I hung my hopes, vainly it turned out, in an international solution, in an impulse solution that would save the parties from themselves and salvage the two-state idea. The preponderant world powers have, however, simply lost interest. Another question is, do we still have an international community? This is an expression that we use very frequently, but what is exactly the international community? When did we last see the international community collectively resolve a dispute? So this is a problem that affects the Palestinian question as well. American monopoly hasn't been able to solve the conflict, and therefore the other parties either do not have the vocation or do not have the power. Power is not enough. America has the vocation. China has power, but they don't have the vocation of a peacemaker or of a global mediator. Russia has power in the Middle East these days, but they do not have the vocation for peacemaking, let alone now after during this tragedy in the Ukraine. So the parties are practically left to themselves. I explained throughout the book why the two-state solution is not applicable in detail. Earlier I gave them the generalities about the clash of narratives. The book goes deeply into the question why eventually it hasn't been attractive enough for the parties to be willing to make the necessary sacrifices, the political sacrifices, in order to reach the solution. Whenever they come close, I mean, they turn the ocean that separates them into a river, but they can't cross the river because at the end of the day, it is not attractive enough to them. To the Palestinians, it will be a mini state sandwiched between two other states that are not particularly friendly to the idea of an independent Palestinian state, Jordan and Israel. And it will, I mean, the colossal tragedy of the Nakba, there is a gap between the colossal tragedy of the Nakba and the poverty of the territorial solution. that will sandwich this demilitarized Palestinian state between two major powers, Israel and Jordan. Also, any solution to the refugees problem that Israel might be willing to accept would be seen by the Palestinians as a betrayal of the constituent ethos of Palestinian nationalism, namely the right of return. Palestine might eventually be illegitimate in the eyes of many factions among the Palestinians or many parts of the Palestinian people. Indeed, interestingly, Fatah, the key component of the PLO, understood that particular dilemma too well. It explicitly admitted that this had been exactly the reason that they had rejected the Clinton peace parameters. The parameters, Fatah said in its website, the days after Clinton presented these parameters, were the biggest trick, they said, for the parameters were designed to shift the conflict from an Israeli-Palestinian dispute to an internal Palestinian conflict. That was the idea, a civil war. That is, when the offer was presented, it split the Palestinian people, and therefore they could not accept it. Now, on the Israeli side, I already advanced what I believe were the flaws of our positions. We didn't seem to have any reliable red lines, and we didn't address with sufficient vigor and imagination the question of Jerusalem. But then the context after Camp David of the Middle East made the idea of an independent Palestinian state even more difficult to digest by the Israelis. The turmoil in Arab geography, the Arab Spring, the fact that the idea of the modern nation state was melting down throughout the region. Syria was disintegrating. Lebanon, the only multi-ethnic state in the region, is in the difficulties that we all know about. The precarious conditions of Jordan, the failing non-state of Hamas in Gaza, the fact that the Egyptians didn't control the Sinai Peninsula, Daesh, all the dissolution of Yemen, of Libya, the sense that the nation state as such didn't strike deep roots. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is the perception, and perceptions are frequently more important than whatever may be objective reality. So this is the Israeli perception. So now to create another Arab state that might melt it down and then create security issues for Israel. So I think that after Camp David, even under difficult conditions, some Israeli governments, mainly the Ehud Olmert, even Netanyahu negotiated with Obama, that is with Abu Mazen, with Abbas, through Obama. And he accepted a peace framework, which nobody could have imagined that his political persona will endorse. He spoke about the borders of 1967, and which for him and for the political family from which he comes was quite revolutionary, and he couldn't reach a settlement through Obama. And then, and before him, Ehud Olmert, after him, Ehud Olmert negotiated a peace deal that went beyond the Clinton peace parameters on two interesting issues. One, the borders. He proposed 100% of the land, calculating the swaps, 100% of the land. He also offered an international solution for the old city in Jerusalem, where even the issue of the sacred cow of Israeli mentality, security, would be in the hands of an international body, not necessarily in the hands of Israel. And this was not enough to meet the requirements of the Palestinians. We always proposed what was the optimum that was possible and not the optimum of what was necessary. I mean, there was always a gap between what was possible politically to digest and what, for the other side, looked like necessary. Today, the question of the two-state solution is no longer even addressed in political discourse. By the way, not even by most of the Palestinians. The younger generation of Palestinians is interested in a one-state solution. Because what really matters today is the end of occupation. The end of occupation prevails over the idea of statehood, because statehood has become an historic impossibility. And therefore, I think that if you see the polls, the surveys that are being conducted regularly, you will see that the question of the two-state solution is not particularly popular among the younger Palestinian generation, nor among the Israelis. The two younger generations are far, far away from the idea of splitting the land into two states. I address the sins of Israeli occupation without any reservations. The book is very clear about it. I even dared to use the expression Lebensraum when addressing the reasons for the persistence of the occupation. That is, Israel is a very small country with the highest birth rate in the West, according to data released by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics. The total fertility rate today for Jews is similar or higher than that of Arabs within the state of Israel, particularly because of the Orthodox community. A small country with such a density, real estate in Israel has become prohibitive in terms of prices, and settlements in the West Bank is one way to solve the problem of density or the quest for real estate. Interestingly, this agrarian hunger should explain how the low-income, ultra-Orthodox, prolific population in Israel was sent to settle in new townships in the West Bank. In fact, the Beitar elite with a population of about 60,000 and Modi'in elite with more than 73,000, the most populated settlements are Orthodox. And this is one of the expressions of the shift of the Orthodox population in Israel from a-Zionist or anti-Zionist positions to becoming almost one with the nationalist settler movement. So the same can be said about Jerusalem, government policies in Jerusalem that is now acquiring the form of an octopus, expanding east and south, almost exclusively beyond the Green Line, responds to the same thirst for real estate. Now, the advocates of a two-state solution still say that, well, you know, the percentages of the settlements are still about 2% or 4%, and therefore you can still solve the problem. But percentages are misleading. It is the nature of some settlements as self-contained cities with a stable population in tens of thousands and doing lavish infrastructures, as well as the geographic spread of the smaller settlements that creates a feature of permanence and irreversibility. In the early 1940s, a historian who was also a deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Meron Ben-Venishti, wrote about the Second Israeli Republic and the irreversibility of the occupation of the territories. Sari Nusseibeh, an enlightened peace seeker, Palestinian peace seeker, the rector of the Al-Quds University, then said, well, it is still early to bury the two-state solution. Let's give it 10 years. Okay, we waited 20 years, and the Sari Nusseibeh has joined the camp of those who no longer believe in the two-state solution. Now, ideas always mushroomed among the Israeli left. And whatever remains of it these days has now produced the two states, one fatherland proposal. That is a Jewish Arab confederation where Jews and Arabs would move freely within their common space. No Israeli settlements in the Palestinian state would be dismantled, and Israel would accept Palestinian refugees in numbers similar to the Jewish population of the settlements. This means that Israel should absorb around 500,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria and Lebanon, and the settlers will remain in the Palestinian state. It is surprising how the fathers of this creature failed to realize that all this amounts, in fact, to the introduction of the one binational state through the back door. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation would, for all practical purposes, be one state with an Arab-Palestinian majority. It would not spare the parties the daily clash between two divergent nationalisms, one seeing itself part of the larger Arab and Muslim world, and the other looking at the West as its natural political and cultural reference. The economic disparities between the two components of the Confederation and the restless creativity of the Israeli socio-economic system would still leave the Israelis as the dominant master race, using cheap Palestinian labor as its hewer of food and drawer of water. In 2020, Israel's per capita income was almost 40,000. Today, I think it is 41,000, 42,000, whereas Palestine's is 3,000. An OECD member, Israel ranks within the top 20 nations in the world on the latest report of the UN's Human Development Index. Colossal disparities exist also in the quality of infrastructures, both physical and scientific. Israel has all the harbors, railways, power stations, desalination plants, nuclear reactors, highway, industrial complexes. It will be such a disparity in political culture, in economic development. We are not going, the Israeli side is not going to embrace the Palestinians, sadly, I would say, as the West Germans embraced their lost brothers in the East. And I advise, I see that there is among the public, perhaps some people from, in the audience here, some people from South Africa. South Africa remains in many ways a segregated state, a segregated economy, and to this very day, in spite of the goodwill and the historic reconciliation between blacks and whites in South Africa. There's a wide literature about it. I would advise you to read Thomas Piketty's Nelson Mandela lecture in 2015 about the socio-economic conditions in South Africa. As I said, I personally came to the conclusion that the Clinton peace parameters that we produced so laboriously and with a president that was imaginative and bold in his final performance by presenting this wise point of equilibrium between the positions of Israelis and Palestinians. I think that the Clinton peace parameters can still be the solution so long as it is they are incorporated into a Jordanian-Palestinian idea. Let me say a few words about the Jordanian solution as I see it, and I will leave the floor for the Q&A. I think they have another 2 minutes or so. Now, the Jordanian solution has a long pedigree. Immediately after the 1967 war, the deputy prime minister then, Yigal Allon, proposed the Allon plan, where he had the idea of incorporating part of the West Bank into a Jordanian Palestinian state and keep the more strategic parts of the West Bank in the hands of Israel. That was a non-starter. And then, of course, during the the first Camp David process between Sadat and Menachem Begin, talks were held about the Palestinian solution with Jimmy Carter and others in his administration. And the idea of a Jordanian Palestinian solution was constantly presented, because the Israelis rejected the idea of a two-state solution then, and the Arab side was not particularly enamored with the idea of a revolutionary Palestinian independent state. The incumbent regimes throughout the Arab world were then and are today conservative regimes that always saw the revolutionary DNA in the Palestinian national movement, and were afraid of the rise of a Gaddafi-like leader in Palestine. That was an expression that was used at the time by Sadat and Jimmy Carter and others. So I think, and when this peace process was inaugurated in the Madrid Peace Conference, the Palestinians were represented in a Jordanian Palestinian solution, delegation, indicating the possibility of a Palestinian Jordanian solution as well. Oslo was a departure from Madrid. It bypassed Madrid by going directly to the Palestinians and ignoring the Jordanians. So today we can say that Oslo has failed in its objective, in its final objective, that was the two-state solution. And it failed because it circumvented the fundamental premise of the Madrid Peace Conference, that the fundamental premise of the entire process as it was born in Madrid. Today, I think we need to go back to the Jordanian-Palestinian thing. In 2007, two former Jordanian prime ministers, Majali and El-Masri, and the prominent Palestinian Jordanian Adnan Abu Odeh, proposed the idea of a Jordanian Palestinian Confederation. When asked why in 2007, why is this suddenly you come with the idea of a Palestinian Jordanian Confederation? They say that Ehud Olmert's disengagement plan, his idea to disengage unilaterally from the territories, would create such an anarchy in the West Bank that would spill over to the other side of the Jordan and destabilize the Hashemite kingdom. So if you ask today a Jordanian leader, do you want a Palestinian Jordanian Confederation? You would say yes, but first negotiate separately with the Palestinians an independent Palestinian state, since a confederation is a unity created by two independent states. But if they send us back to the negotiating table, we are back to square one, and we are incapable of reaching an agreement with the Palestinians. The Jordanians need to, that was the idea of El-Masri and of Majali, that the Jordanians should be part of the negotiating process, not just say, go solve the problem, and then we'll talk with the Palestinians of the possibility of a Jordanian Palestinian state. So I think that, of course, when Israelis say the Jordanian Palestinian solution, they meant we will keep part of the land and give you the rest of it. According to Alon, we would have gotten about 60% of the land and the rest for the Jordanian Palestinian state. What I say, no, is take the Clinton peace parameters as the basis of the Palestinian state within the broader Jordanian Palestinian Confederation. We should discard entirely the idea of a binational state. That is, that it started with as an ivory tower nonsense, frankly, by some scholars, and in reality, it would be a nightmare. What we saw in the last confrontation with Hamas in Gaza, what we saw in Israeli mixed Jewish Arab cities is a promo of what we will see in a state of, in a binational state. These are days of upheaval, where the ominous fragility of the liberal order and the rise of white nationalisms are pulling the West, the entire West, back to its darkest hours. In this age of rampant populism and xenophobia, not even liberal Europe is able to digest multi-ethnicity. Why on earth would anyone assume that what did not work for Czechs and Slovaks, for Turks and Greeks in Cyprus, for the entire multi-ethnic universe of the former Yugoslavia that was shattered in an outburst of narcissism of minor differences, leading to civil wars, mass slaughter, and ethnic cleansing, and for practically all the Arab countries throughout the Middle East, where minorities are suppressed, gassed, and slaughtered. Why would this work in Israel-Palestine? Are our two monumentally divergent national egos in a state of war for more than a century now going to coexist peacefully in a region where even Muslims are immersed in an ongoing inter-Muslim war that is ripping apart states and communities, and the only multi-ethnic democracy, Lebanon, is falling apart? It's a non-starter. Two-state solution, the old style, didn't work. We need to integrate the solution within a Jordanian Palestinian state based on the Clinton peace parameter, more or less, or perhaps the Ehud Olmert, and then have a robust intervention of the international community, mainly the United States, because it is the only power that has the leverage, and more importantly, the vocation for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really a wonderful presentation. I think one of the great strengths that you bring to this topic is that, unlike most, you are both a historian and a participant in the history that you're describing. You have both perspectives as both a scholar and a practitioner and as a diplomat. So I want to begin, first of all, going back to the past, and particularly following up and with some of your comments and some questions that have come in about the Camp David summit and the last months of the peace process leading up to and including the Tabar talks in January of 2001. Then I want us to talk a little bit about the situation today, and we'll then end with going and talking about the future and the ideas that you presented regarding a Jordanian Palestinian state. So a lot to cover. I will try and be quick. To begin with, when it comes to the Camp David summit of July 2000, about which there's still a debate as to whose fault the failure of that summit was, and whether it was destined to fail or whether it could have succeeded. So as somebody who was there in those in the woods in Maryland at Camp David in July 2000 and witnessed firsthand the negotiations that took place, I want to ask you first of all whether you buy into the idea that one of the things that contributed to the failure of Camp David was Barak's Ehud Barak's negotiating style. You alluded to this previously, that I believe he wouldn't meet face to face or negotiate face to face with Arafat. He refused to do that, and instead, his offers, which, as you know, kind of increased over time, were delivered through the Americans primarily, rather than in a kind of face to face talk. Do you think had Arafat and Barak actually got together during those 2 weeks, sat down, negotiated face to face, would that have made a difference?
I wonder. You can't imagine more different personalities than Barak and Arafat. Barak was overbearing. He was full of himself. He was a Cartesian who thought in sort of logical terms. He was not a messianic. He was not a he was not a peacenik. He was a security man who, like Rabin, saw peace as an instrument for reaching security. And whereas Arafat was a historical figure immersed in Palestinian mythologies, and a warrior, an old warrior who saw himself as the embodiment of a nation, and he believed that he had already made the necessary concessions by accepting 22% of the land, which of mandatory Palestine, and he didn't need to make any further concessions. Whereas Barak came with ideas that were a non-starter for negotiations. He had this attitude of proposing something and then assuming that he knows better than his interlocutor what is good for the interlocutor, and he would then withdraw into his cabin when his proposals were rejected. And the Palestinian side didn't make counter proposals because the Palestinians didn't think they have to make counter proposals at all. For them, this was a colonial occupation, and you don't make counter proposals to the colonial power. The colonial power has simply to go away. So that was the mentality on the other side. But Arafat was very smart in managing the summit in the following way. He understood that Barak doesn't have a solution for Jerusalem from the very beginning. He saw the summit as an ambush that was prepared by the trap that was prepared by the Israelis and the Americans. He felt like he was in the bunker in Beirut during the 1982 war, and he needed to disengage without any particular harm on him or his nation. So he, at some point, he said to Clinton, if you give me a solution for Jerusalem, then if they want to annex for their settlements 10% of the land, I have no problem with it. And then Clinton asked him, what about land swaps? He said, you decide, Mr. President, I trust you. So he gave that pledge, which later on he withdrew the pledge. But nevertheless, there was a moment when he made the pledge, knowing very well that Barak cannot offer the kind of solution on Jerusalem that he can embrace. So I think that by making Jerusalem the center of the conference, he in fact announced its failure. But then he came out from Camp David with a package, which was not sufficient. And I have a whole chapter in the book about the Intifada. It is immaterial whether he initiated or not the Intifada, but he used it because he wanted to soften Israel's positions. And he got it through the Clinton peace parameters. But then it was not enough for him. I think that the meeting of characters was impossible. There's no doubt about it. But I'm afraid that the positions were such that were irreconcilable, at least at that particular point of the summit. He himself later said to Dennis Ross, Arafat, I got from Barak much more than I ever got from my partner Rabin. So he did recognize that he never got something like this during the entire process. But again, it was not sufficient. Arafat was the kind of negotiator or decision maker. He always said, I'm not a negotiator, I take decisions. But he was the kind of leader that would push you until he assumes that he gets the kind of solution that would not cause a civil war in Palestine. You see, that was a major and continues to be a major difference, I trust, between the parties. We, with all our imperfections, are still a democracy where there is the rule of the majority. In the Palestinian case, I'm not saying they don't have the calling of a democracy. I'm not saying that at all. Please do not misunderstand me. The only thing I say is that they are a national movement. And the national movement as such is unpredictable in the sense of what would be the next stage of the movement. For example, would Hamas take over? If you have today free elections in Palestine, Hamas would take over. Would Hamas go along with the idea of a two-state solution based on the border of 67 and no right of return, because there is no Israeli government conceivably accepting the right of return? I wonder. So I think that in that sense, I think that Arafat was afraid. I brought the quotation from Fatah when they rejected the Clinton peace parameter. They said this will cause a civil war in Palestine. So what Arafat wanted is, since the idea of majority and minorities is not the essence of the national movement, it was all embodied by Arafat, he said, I need to spare myself the risk of a civil war by pushing the Israelis to what Israelis saw as a black hole, because it never ended. He always expected a new proposal, and for the Israelis, it was simply impossible, and he broke our neck. He broke our political neck, and we were defeated. He was always sure that we have political possibilities to win the elections against Sharon. And
so
then
he miscalculated, in a sense, the space that existed in Israeli politics, and you know, your analysis suggests he was concerned, understandably, about his own standing, about his life, about the risk of a Palestinian civil war. All of that suggests, though, that he did sincerely, maybe he was very constrained and his style of negotiating was counterproductive, but he was willing to make peace, contrary to the claim, the very famous claim that Barak made after Camp David, that there is no Palestinian partner. And it's still said to this day that, you know, Arafat's rejection of Barak's quote unquote generous offer at Camp David is proof that the Palestinians aren't interested in peace. This is a question that's come in from Richard Landis. Do you agree with that? I mean, based upon what you observed and your knowledge, that was there a desire for peace on the part of the Palestinian leadership, at least in Camp David? Maybe there was a mistake as to the price that Israel was willing to go. But this idea that there was no, or still is no, Palestinian partner, can you comment on that?
Yeah, frankly, if Arafat remains an enigma to everybody, really. I mean, it's extremely difficult to say what was his final objective. He was always a master of double talk, double speaking. I mean, you never could, you know, pin him down and get from him a clear sense of what does he really want. He would always speak in catchwords, in phrases that he would repeat. If there is a will, there is a way. He would put perhaps the will, and you will put the way, or you will have to put the will and the way. 10 days before he needed to give an answer to the Clinton peace parameters, I met his people in Gaza and at the Erez crossing, the border between Israel and Gaza. And I gave him a call. I told him, listen, all the reservations that your people put here on the table bring us back to square one. I mean, and we are 10 days before practically the end of the Clinton presidency. We can't clinch a deal by then. He said, no, we'll do it before that. That is even before that. So either he was unrealistic or he was miscalculating the margins of maneuver of his interlocutor. You see, as I said at the beginning, there is no such a thing as a perfect peace deal anywhere. Peace is not about justice. Peace is about stability. It's about finding the kind of relative justice that gives you the optimum that you can get given the conditions. If your interlocutor is politically broken, you are going to get nothing. And this is what happened to Arafat eventually. And this is what happened to Abu Mazen as well, to Abbas. Abbas was incapable of saying yes to the proposals that were made later on by Obama and that is by George W. Bush first, and then by Obama. Why he was incapable? First, because he was not the kind of absolute leader, charismatic figure, the founder of the national movement that Arafat was. And second, because he could not depart from Arafat's positions, because he would be seen as betraying the legacy of the mythical leader. And also, Abu Mazen had Hamas as a major power, which Arafat still could control. It was during his days, Hamas was still in its incipient stages. So I think for all these reasons, there was no encounter really. There was no a point of encounter where the two parties could say, okay, this is the deal. It is imperfect, but it gives us statehood, dignity, independence, not the bigger dream, but yes, a reasonable dream.
So,
and it didn't work out. Yeah.
So I want to now, we have a lot of questions and only a little bit of time. So I want to ask you now about the future, and particularly the questions coming in about your proposal for a Palestinian Jordanian confederation. And a number of the questions, point to question the feasibility of this for a couple of reasons. First, the question as to whether the Palestinians would accept this. If given Palestinian nationalism, given the fact that Palestinians don't have any popular, there's no grassroots desire among Palestinians to align with Jordan or for there to be a Jordanian Palestinian confederation, why would the Palestinians, having rejected these offers with Israel, want to submerge their own nationalism and within a Jordanian Palestinian confederation? And on the other side of it, the question of the Jordanians, and King Hussein's father renounced Jordan's claim to the West Bank when the first Intifada broke out, and in many ways, there's long been the view that the Palestinian state Palestinian nationalism is a threat to the Hashemite kingdom, the Hashemite rule in Jordan. So wouldn't they see this? Why would they really want this? And then the third side is Hamas and the Gaza Strip. Hamas, as you've said, have opposed offers for a two-state solution. Wouldn't they also object to being part of a confederation with Jordan? And would Jordan want Gaza?
Okay.
So a lot of questions there. And
in 1988, when King Hussein declared that the West Bank is no longer his concern, and it is for the Palestinians to negotiate with Israel the future of the occupied territories, the Muslim Brotherhood opposed it, because the statehood is not the main objective of the Muslim or Hamas. It is secondary. Islam, the broader Muslim family, is more important than separate statehood. Second point I would make is that, as I said before, today for the Palestinians, the most important thing is the end of occupation. This is more important than statehood. Since our focus on finding a way to create a state has perpetuated the occupation, then let us start with the end of occupation. That's the most important. This is the reason why the younger generation, as I said, is interested in a one-state reality. So end the occupation. We want to be Israeli citizens, as it were. Now, the third point is that Khalil Shkaki's polls, surveys, show a constant support for the idea of a Jordanian Palestinian state among Palestinians, not because it is their dream, again, because it is another way to bring an end to the occupation. Not a big majority, but in 2012, Abu Mazen showed interest on it, and then polls showed something like 42% supporting. So I think that it is not at all a non-starter. Yeah. It has a level of support among the Palestinian population. Now, you see, Palestinian nationalism has grown under Israeli occupation. But don't forget that its origins are Gazan, are essentially a Gaza affair. And the West Bank was always home to more universal or all Arab philosophies of political philosophies, if it is communism, confederations, etc., etc. So I think that given the elimination of all other options, the two-state solution with, arithmetically calculated land swaps, as we negotiated, all this stuff is dead. It is, you don't try even to imagine Israelis and Palestinians going back to the negotiating table along the lines of the old peace process. I don't believe it will happen. There are no political conditions either there or here. And therefore, the introduction of Jordan into it, which is for the Israelis, it is traditionally a reliable state with many problems. This is not something that can happen without a robust assistance coming from the international community, mainly again the United States, to strengthen the Jordanian state, to consolidate its economic situation. It will make Jordan, that has always been seen as a spoil, as a prey by countries like Syria and others, it will make it a robust entity in the region. A Jordanian-Palestinian state. It will also facilitate the concept of demilitarization of the West Bank. It would be a kind of Sinai Peninsula between Israel and Egypt, with the Suez Canal that serves even today as a buffer between the two armies. So Israel always trusted the Arab Legion, and I think that essentially, if these are two political entities, independent but confederated, with Israel maintaining its unique relations with it, at some point, perhaps it can be a kind of Benelux. It can be three entities: Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. But I think the most immediate or foreseeable scenario could be, if indeed you have the right government in Israel and you have the right ideas coming from Washington once it has its attention focused again on Israel, Palestine, it will have it sooner or later, because it is true that this is the first administration in many years that hasn't sent a peace envoy to the region. That's a very interesting difference between the Biden administrations and all former presidents, because they don't believe in a settlement. But all the good things that happened in the Middle East as a whole, between Israel and the Arab world, happened tragically and sadly after a war, not before a war. Without the 1948 war, you wouldn't have had the armistice agreements. Without the Yom Kippur War, you wouldn't have had the Israel-Egypt settlement. If it were not for the first Intifada and the Gulf War, you wouldn't have had the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo Accords. Sad, but this is human nature, or the nature of nations and states and entities. Today, the unintended consequences of what is going on in Jerusalem, what is going on between Israel and Hamas. Today, attention is focused in Ukraine, but it isn't eternal. Tomorrow, the young generation in Jerusalem that has turned Temple Mount into the icon of its resistance to Israeli occupation might explode at some point. Inevitably, it will explode. So, and then again, ideas will have to be raised how to address the problem. And then you will see, hopefully, international stakeholders getting interested again, and Israel being forced, in spite of the practical political elimination of the Israeli left, precisely because of the failure of the peace process. This has been the response of Israelis to the failures, to the deceptions of the peace process. So in spite of all, at some point, the DNA, I believe that the DNA of Zionism is more about demography than about territory. And once you see the Jewish state that was created as the refuge for the Jewish people, that it was created as the only state where Jews could say, okay, this is our home, is being diluted in a one-state reality, and in a South African situation without a South African solution, because Jewish minority in a one big Jewish Palestinian, Jewish Arab state, the Israeli minority would never concede power to the majority. You will not have a South African solution, and that it will be a constant state of civil war. So when this DNA prevails, the demography, the fear of a demographic doomsday prevails, we will have to address territorial solutions, and it will be, I hope so, and we should struggle for it. The Clinton peace parameters for a Palestinian state that is confederated with a Jordanian state. And at some point down the road, perhaps Israel would form part of that confederation, but I don't think this should be at the beginning of the solution. It would be at some point down the road.
Well, thank you.
By the way, I mentioned these once to Arafat, and he was fully in agreement. He said, yes, that is a great idea. He said we can add Lebanon also to the confederation. But anyway, that was a typical kind of Arafat. But he negotiated with Hussein a Palestinian Jordanian state, with Palestine being that is a federal state, with Palestine being part of the federal state. And Arafat, like Arafat, at some point just left. He left it as it is. And Hussein was very much taken aback by it, and his answer was, "Okay, that this is your decision, but the common destiny of our two peoples cannot be betrayed forever." That was more or less what Hussein told Arafat.
Well, I want to thank you. I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I think it's really important to, first of all, to continue to remain committed to the idea of resolving this conflict, and also to be thinking about creative ways to do so. And I know I'm speaking for myself on behalf of everyone. We're very grateful to you for presenting this very this bold idea, a new old idea maybe. I wish we could have you and Yossi Beilin together on the same webinar. He will be joining us. I will be speaking with him and Hiba Husseini this coming Sunday about their proposal for a Holy Land Confederation, the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. So whether it's a Palestinian-Jordanian Confederation, or an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, or maybe even a Israeli-Palestinian-Jordanian Confederation, it's fascinating that there is this serious consideration now, and from very serious people, veteran negotiators, to consider these ideas. I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge with us, and thank all the audience for joining us. A reminder that this webinar will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel, so please share it widely, and go out and purchase Professor Ben-Ami's book as soon as possible, because it will just really go into so much detail about many of these really fascinating issues that we've been hearing about today. So thank you, Professor Ben-Ami. Hopefully we will be able to welcome you back to UCLA in person at some point in the future, and thank you all for joining with us today, and hopefully you will come on for our next webinar on Sunday, this coming Sunday, March 6th, when I will be talking with Yossi Beilin and Hiba Husseini about their new plan for an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. Thank you.
Thank you.